We're in a world where people are very scared of insulin spikes. And I don't blame them. If you eat sugar and other foods that cause your blood sugar to go up, it'll cause your insulin to spike so that it can package up that blood glucose and pull it out of your bloodstream. But if your insulin is high for too long, then you can get something called insulin resistance, where your body just doesn't respond to insulin as well. Then your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin. But this can only happen up to a certain point. And this can lead to a lot of different metabolic disorders like diabetes. So I understand the concern, but I feel like at some point it gets a little too exaggerated. A lot of different foods will spike your insulin to some degree, including some so-called healthy foods like fruits. So if you are worried about diabetes, should you be worried about eating fruits? Well, this is why I wore my fruit shirt today, because I want to talk about fruits. The problem here really comes down to the mechanism of how something works versus what actually happens in humans. What I mean by that is, in theory, it makes sense that fructose is bad for you, and if fructose is in fruits, then you should avoid it if you want to prevent things like diabetes. But when you look at what actually happens in humans, that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, actually the opposite happens. So let's look at some studies. So this was a study done by Harvard back in 2013, and it was published in BMJ. And they were looking at 3 very large cohort studies where they would get follow-ups every 2 years. At the baseline of all of these studies, all the participants were healthy and they didn't have any diabetes. What they found was a greater consumption of whole fruits, particularly fruits like blueberries, grapes, and apples, was significantly associated with the lower risk of getting type 2 diabetes. Now, before you go and only start eating these specific fruits, I don't think it was the specific fruits that made the biggest difference. And we're going to talk more about that later too. They also did more analyses, and they found that for every 3 servings a week, your risk for type 2 diabetes was 26% less when you had those 3 servings of blueberries, 12% less for 3 servings of grapes and raisins, 7% for apples, 5% for bananas, and 5% for grapefruit. Now, something interesting is cantaloupe consumption had a slightly higher risk with type 2 diabetes. They did also mention that melons tend to have less phytonutrients than some of the other fruits. But is this small correlation between melons and diabetes clinically significant? I don't think so. And the study even said that after they adjusted for personal factors like lifestyle and other things, that cantaloupe consumption being associated with diabetes was no longer significant. The study also said that the glycemic load that you get from eating fruits wasn't really relevant when comparing it to type 2 diabetes, which is pretty surprising, right? Your glycemic load is how much something raises your blood sugar. So if something has a higher glycemic load, chances are it's going to put you at a higher risk for getting diabetes. But in the groups that they studied, fruits only contributed to about 10% of their total glycemic load. So in other words, whole fruits really aren't the problem. The other 90% of the sugar that you're eating really is the problem. One of those things being fruit juices. A lot of people think that eating fruits and drinking fruit juice is practically the same thing, but that's not really the case. Luckily, this study was looking at fruit juice, and they found that fruit juices like orange juice led to a much more rapid and larger rise in blood sugar levels compared to whole fruits. And also, while eating whole fruits was associated with a lower risk of getting diabetes, drinking the fruit juice actually had a higher risk of getting diabetes. And this makes sense because the whole fruit has a lot more nutrients and it has a lot more fiber in it. Whereas the juice, you're taking away a lot of those nutrients and a lot of that fiber and just being left with that plain sugar. For instance, according to the study, 1 raw whole orange had a glycemic load of 6.2 and 3.1 grams of fiber. And orange juice, on the other hand, had a glycemic load of 13.4 and only 0.5 grams of fiber. So basically, when you're drinking that orange juice, you're doubling the amount of your glucose spike, but you're also getting much less of that fiber. So you're also getting that glucose spike a lot faster. And the study did also find that when you sub out your juices for whole fruits, that again will lower your risk for type 2 diabetes. Now, a quick side note, I do not want you to confuse drinking juice with drinking a smoothie. I don't want you to be scared of smoothies because smoothies you still keep a lot of the fiber and a lot of the nutrients as opposed to a juice. But I think the study is showing pretty consistently that juice is not good for you, but whole fruits are good for you. Now, does the specific type of fruit actually matter? Well, it is true that certain fruits have more sugar in them and certain fruits have different levels of their polyphenols and other nutrients in them. But in general, I don't think this is very significant. I think it's better to just try to get a variety of fruits. The main thing you should focus on is avoid the fruit juices and try to eat the whole fruits or at least drink a smoothie. Now, just to further help clarify this other study published in the American Diabetes Association was looking at the relationship between the quantity and the variety of fruit and vegetable intake and the risk for getting type 2 diabetes. So this was a cohort study that went on for 11 years, and people that were on the highest end of eating more fruits and vegetables had a 21% lower risk of getting type 2 diabetes. And also in particular, those who had a greater variety in their fruit intake had a lower risk in getting type 2 diabetes. They also said that having a higher fruit and vegetable intake led to a lower BMI, lower waist circumference, and higher physical activity levels. Now look, a lot of these things are pretty obvious. I mean, eating fruits and vegetables are obviously good for you. But what I'm really trying to show is why you shouldn't be afraid of eating fruits because of all the good that's in fruits as well. For one, fruits have a lot of fiber, which in itself can lower the amount of glucose spike we get from the sugar in the fruit. Even though the fructose that's in fruits is the same fructose that's in high fructose corn syrup, it won't cause as much of that spike because of the fiber. And you can even do a quick Google search. Just search the glycemic index of different foods and you can see what foods cause what level of a glucose spike. And you'll see that most fruits are actually on the lower side of that scale. Fruits are also loaded with antioxidants and phytochemicals that you just don't really get from other foods. For example, they have polyphenols, which can help fight inflammation and oxidative stress. And not to mention you get a ton of vitamins from fruits like vitamin C and potassium that you again do not get from a lot of other sources of sugar. These can help your health overall and even improve your immune system. So that was a quick summary of the benefits you get from fruits. But these benefits can actually offset the risk of diabetes and actually help explain why they even prevent you from getting diabetes, even though they have sugar. So the bottom line is, do not worry so much about the mechanism of how something can work if we have human studies showing they have actual good outcomes. In theory, it would make sense that if you're worried about diabetes, you should avoid all sugar, including fruits. But studies like these ones that I mentioned and plenty others show what actually happens in humans when you start actually consuming these foods. The more fruits people eat, the more vegetables people eat, the more whole grains people eat, consistently it shows better health outcomes, including lowering your risk for type 2 diabetes. I know there's a lot of different theories, a lot of different opinions out there, and it can sound really convincing on the internet when someone says, this is the fructose you get from some fruit, and this is what it can do to your blood sugar, and this is what it can therefore do to your risk of getting diabetes. But humans and foods are really complex. You can't break it down to one single mechanism because there are thousands of mechanisms that are going on at the same time, not just one. So while it is easy to say that you should avoid fructose because it can cause insulin spikes and lead to diabetes, it's a lot easier to actually just look at the human data and see what happens to humans when they eat more fruits. Because you might not be looking at the mechanism of eating more fiber will actually end up lowering your risk for diabetes, or eating more of these phytonutrients or more of these antioxidants or many of these other vitamins and fruits will actually all end up lowering your risk for certain diseases. So again, I'm going to say it one more time, don't get too tied up in these single mechanisms.
Hey guys, I know there's a lot of videos on the internet about the importance of sleep and what sleep does for us, and even some videos about how to improve your sleep. But I want to go over 11 very specific things that drastically improved my sleep. Now, I'm willing to bet that a lot of the things on my list are things that you haven't heard about. Number one is using a